But let's just pick up where we were. I was talking about that very interesting theory of Rabbi Shimon Schwab, Zichron Livracha, who was the successor of Rabbi Joseph Breuer, Zichron Livracha, at the Breuer's community in Washington Heights. And I mentioned that he was elected as associate rabbi when he was 34 years old, thinking that Rabbi Breuer is now 75 and it's Beseda, he'll be a chief rabbi there soon, except nobody told him that Rabbi Breuer was going on till age 99 and to serve as the rabbi. So when he became the chief rabbi of the community, he was already collecting Social Security for 2 years. He was 67 years old. But anyway, there was a Jubilee dinner. There was a Jubilee dinner and book that was put out, and Rabbi Schwab wrote this very fascinating article, Comparative Calendar, in which he contrasted what we might call the Jewish calendar using Tanakh as the basis, and then whatever was known about the second Beit HaMikdash era, because Tanakh takes us to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and just a little bit into the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash, and then we're just out in the field, and there are different discrepancies in what happened exactly in the second Beit HaMikdash era. So we know that in general history, the first Beit HaMikdash was recorded, its destruction in the year 586, before the Common Era. Which means 70 years later, we have the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash, which would put it at about 516 BCE, which would make the second Beit HaMikdash, until its destruction in the year 70 of the Common Era, something that lasted 586 years, 505 years, 506 years. But that doesn't jive with what Chazal say, that the second Beit HaMikdash stood for 420 years. And the theory of Rav Schwab, while on the one hand not negating the general historic record, and on the other hand not contradicting what our Chazal said, was to propose a type of in-between view of some sort. And he claimed, and this was a dramatic suggestion, that Chazal deliberately hid 165 years from the second Beit HaMikdash era, because they felt that there was a possibility of discovering, by interpretation of psukim in the book of Daniel, when exactly Mashiach would come. And the Chazal wanted to mess us up. It's a phenomenal theory, but if it's correct, then it turns out that today we are in Tafshin Pei Hey, which is 5,785, tack on another 165 years to that, and we are actually in the year 5,940, which means we're just 60 years away from the magic number 6,000, which according to one opinion in the Gemara, and I'll tell you right away, the Rambam doesn't even make mention of it, but there's such an opinion that by the year 6,000, Mashiach comes whether we deserve it or not. That's like the end game. And as we move towards it, we're going to sense that we're actually moving towards that era, which to a certain degree in the last 120 years, we do have that feeling with so many things happening with OUisrael, and specifically here in Eretz Yisrael. So 60 years, we're all, most of us here sitting here across the age of 40 already. And so 60 years is a little bit off, but it's not way off when we talk about our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, not way off at all. And that means that we're almost there. So again, I don't know if Rabbi Schwab was correct or not. I guess history will tell and time will tell, but it was a phenomenal suggestion. But yeah, the Rambam recommends not to do it. Rambam recommends not to do it, not to forecast, because he says you're going to fall into the trap of being wrong more often than not. And I can tell you that our Barbanel, who's living at the time of the expulsion from Spain in 1492, is a real Rambamist. He's really in line with the Rambam's thoughts, and yet in 1492 he sticks his neck out and makes a prediction that in 1506 Mashiach is coming. And you know what happened in 1506 and Mashiach didn't come? He said he was wrong, but the calculation is really 1521. And what he was actually doing was buying time. He felt that OUisrael was in such dire straits that if they didn't have an immediate type of prediction of coming a Mashiach, they would have just let go. They would have let go completely. And by 1521, the situation, somehow eased up, and we were able to move on. look, the Satmar Rebbe was of the opinion that the whole Zionist enterprise was just an extension of Shabtai Tzvi. And Shabtai Tzvi came around as a result of the 1648 pogroms, the Chelmenitchke pogroms, where Am Yisrael really needed something to hang on to. And the feeling of some was that after the Shoah, we needed something to hang on to. Except that things are very different, very, very different today. Yeah, right, we have certainly hung on. And the Rav Zichron Livracha saw this, if you read his Kol Dodi Dofek of Yom Ha'atzmaut speech of 1956, how he saw the spiritual connection between the aftermath of the Shoah and the Kum Hamdina. But anyway, we got off the tangent there 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whenever it was. And we were talking a little bit about Mashiach in topics which will pertain to Yigdal. Let me just go through the Yigdal again, the whole thing. We'll see all the 13 principles of the Rambam as poetically rendered by Rabbi Daniel ben Yehuda Hadayan of Italy of the 16th century. And a lot of people don't know that this is the 13 principles of the Rambam, but they are, in his poetic way. It was pointed out by some scholars of Rambam that the Siddur actually contains contradictory philosophical ideas, because the Rambam says what he says about many, many important and very fundamental ideas of Judaism, about the nature of God, for example. And yet there were others who had slightly different takes on some of the things that the Rambam believed was very dogmatic. So the fact that the Rambam said it didn't mean that everybody just dropped what they had in mind and they went along. Some did, but many didn't. And even though some will say, I swear by every line of the Yigdal, I'm in there for sure, yet there are things in the Siddur itself later on that actually consider Kabbalistic ideas that differ somewhat from what the Rambam had in mind. The idea that there is no divisibility in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The word Echad, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, means that there is no divisibility. So if you just take a look at the first two lines of Yigdal, so Yigdal Elohim Chai V'Yishtabach, Kadosh Baruch Hu's name will be great and everything. Nimtza ve'ein eit el mitzuoto. What does the word nimtza mean? He's existing, his existence, and there is no time framework for his existence, which means that Kadosh Baruch Hu is eternal, right? He was, is, and will be. Haya, hoveh, v'yiyeh. And I believe I mentioned last year that the Rambam tells us in his Guide to the Perplexed, the Mar Nevuchim, that the word Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Shem Havaya, which we don't pronounce, is really a contraction of those three words, Haya, hoveh, v'yiyeh. And he goes even further and says that if heard by the Kohanim at Birkat Kohanim in Beit HaMikdash, you would sense eternity. There's a word for that. What is called onomatopoeia? That sometimes you have a word, bakbuk, 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 and you hear the bakbuk, right? Yeah. So he said, the Rambam believes that the articulation of the Shem Havaya generated a sensation of eternity. Okay, so I'm just giving over what the Rambam says. I don't think he heard it either, but it was a suggestion on his part. And this is clear. That's not challenged by any Jewish theologian. What is challenged is by Greek philosophers who believed about the eternity of the world, the eternity of, even those who did believe in a divine, believed, the world was also eternal and went side by side. So the Kadosh Baruch Hu wasn't there alone at the time of Briat Olam. That's challenged by Greek philosophers, and obviously the Rambam takes them to task on this. But then in the second line, Echad ve'ein yachid ki yichudo. He's one, but not the same one that we are used to. Because when you say one, it's against the system of numbers. It's not 2, it's not 3, it's not 4, it's not 5. There's no 2, 3, 4, 5 about God. The number 1 with regard to Kadosh Baruch Hu means unique. There's something very singular and unique about Kadosh Baruch Hu. Ne'elam, he's like gone. In Hebrew, you can translate ne'elam means gone, but it doesn't mean gone. It means he's just not apparent. You can't touch him. You can't see him. You can't smell him. The senses are not there. Ve'gam ein sof la'achduto. Yeah.
in Hebrew with Matt is unknown.
Unknown. Yafeh, okay. He is unknown. He's unknown because you can't use your physical senses to grasp that he's around, Bichlal. He's even here. How do we know that something exists? Because either we see it, we smell it, we hear it, we touch it, and all this is, Kadosh Baruch Hu, you can't do that. So how do you know that he's even here around? It's just unknown. Ne'alam. V'gam ein sof la'achduto. There's no end to his oneness, which means there's no possibility of thinking of the oneness of a Kadosh Baruch Hu that they're going to be altered in any way or manner. The Rambam's taking a little bit of a stab at Christianity, that believed that Kadosh Baruch Hu revealed himself through a human being called Yeshu. So I mentioned that when my daughter was in 12th grade, my daughter Hannah, she wrote a paper for Jewish thought, Machshavet Yisrael course, and it was basically to take the 13 principles of the Rambam and divide them into 4 categories of challenges. Rambam had a challenge against Greek philosophy. He was challenged by Christianity. He was challenged by Islam. And he was challenged by the Karaites, which was a Jewish sect that deviated from some of the basic norms. And just recently, within the last year, I discovered that the very, very important Talmud Chacham Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'aleh Adumim, Rav Yitzchak Shilat, came up with the same idea. And my only question is, who came first? Right? Who came first? So I looked at the date of the publication of Rav Shilat's Hakdamot of the Rambam, and it was 1996. And I asked my daughter, when did you write that paper? I think she said 1997. So I said, so you stole it. So she told me, she reminded me that I told her this. And she wrote it up. And she actually has it. She was going to give me the paper. I said, I'd like to see it, what she wrote. But I was very happy to see that we were barking up the right tree, that Rav Shilat also understood it as such. And we'll see another idea that Rav Shilat said in a moment. So this idea of Ein Sof La'achduto, and then I'm just going to go on, Ein Lo Demut Haguf Ve'eino Guf Lo Naroch Elav Kedushato. There is no figure. There is no human figure, animal figure, any type of figure of what we call corporeality of God. That God is something of a corpus, of a figure, of a shape. None of that. None of that. Now here the Rambam got into a little trouble because there were not only are there Mamarei Chazal that seem to indicate that we are small, but maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so large, but we don't see him because he's so large. And the proof is that Torah says that we were born B'Tselem Elokim. There's some type of reflection of a Kadosh Baruch Hu in mortal human beings. So the Rambam says Tselem comes from the word tzel, which means shadow. And it doesn't mean when you see a shadow, so you can take a light source and put your hand there, and you see a shadow of your palm of your hand with 5 fingers. So that's what you're going to see, the outer imprint of the palm and the 5 fingers. But there's no skin there, there's no muscle, there's no nerve, there's no blood vessels, and there's no anything. There's no life to that shadow. So all it is just a basic external figure of what your fingers look like. So the Rambam says human beings are just a slight shadow of what a Kadosh Baruch Hu is. And he defines what that is, and he says it's human intellect. That the human intellect, which is the Tselem Elokim. Vayevra Elokim et Adam b'tzalmo, b'tselem Elokim bara oto. But others have suggested that because in Tanakh there are so many figures that are associated with God, Etz Belokim, Yad Agdolah, and so on, finger of God, great hand of God, and so on, Zroa Netuyah, what? Hadom Raglav, and so on. Right, there's just infinite number. So the Rambam's one swipe answer to all of that is Dibrak Torah Kilashon B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in human language, human figure, so we can just get a gist of what's going on. But we have to explain all of them, where one it means power, one it means being connected, and so on. Yeah. Right. That's how the Rambam understands in Moreh Nevuchim. He spends many, many chapters explaining all of these figures. Yet in the Hot Shuvah of the Mishneh Torah, the Ravid, Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam says, 1 second, you can't call all these people apikosim who had different opinions on this matter about guf, body, of shape, because there were some greats out there who actually thought so, and you're really going to call them all apikosim? I mean, so it's not that the Ravid, Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam, disagrees with the Rambam. All he says was when the Rambam starts calling them names and saying, if you don't believe this, you don't believe that, you're an apikoros, and you don't have olam haba. And the Ravid reminds us that there are some great people out there who now the Rambam is putting into this category of kofrim, of heretics. And the Ravid doesn't want to do that. Yeah.
It's implied that God had a figure if there was tzimtzum. There had to be something with that sense.
So tzimtzum is a Kabbalistic idea that you will not find in the Rambam. Tzimtzum means contraction. And it means, if we try to describe this, that Kadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere. In kindergarten, they taught this in America. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is everywhere. Right? Okay. Kadosh Baruch Hu. So all there is a Kadosh Baruch Hu. But then, according to the Kabbalists, HaKadosh Baruch Hu retreats from wherever his existence is and opens up a hole. And that hole is the creation of the world, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu voluntarily gave up on that hole, and expands that hole. That hole becomes the created universe, but is interested to be invited back into the hole. And that's really, according to the Kabbalists, the job of bringing Kedusha into this world. Every time you say a bracha, you bring a Kadosh Baruch Hu back into this world. So that's the concept of tzimtzum. Rambam doesn't have that at all. So there are things that you have, for example, with regard to tefillah. In the slichot, so we have slichot coming up in Shavas B'Tammuz, but the big time slichot in the month of Elul, before Rosh Hashanah and between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, Machnise Rachamim. I mean, Yitzhak Meir does a great piece on Machnise Rachamim, and basically it's calling on the angels to take our tefillot and bring them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Vilna Gaon said, do not dare say that section, Machnise Rachamim, because it goes against the grain of what the Rambam is saying here, of any type of intervention between you and HaKadosh Baruch Hu in tefillah. And, it almost sounds Christian, where you have to have the church you can't work between you and God in Christianity. You have to work through the church, and the priest becomes the medium to do that. We don't have that. We don't need that. And the Rambam even goes on to tell us that the whole issue of korbanot was something that OUisrael coming out of Egypt, they didn't know anything better, anything else. So Kadosh Baruch Hu, lets us have it, korbanot as well. But in theory, tefillah is a higher order of connecting with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So in the same siddur, you're going to have the Rambam's directive here about how to believe in God, and we're going to have other things there that actually contradict it. I'll give you some examples later. But let's go a little further on the line. Kadmon l'chol davar asher nivra. Kadosh Baruch Hu was before everything that was created. Rishon ve'en reshit l'reshito. He's the first, and the type of first that doesn't have any equal. There's no other first that it comes close to the concept of the first of God. Hino adon olam l'chol notzar. Kadosh Baruch Hu is the master of the world over all created things, which means because he was the one who created everything else, as he is now the master. Yoreg gedulato malchuto. And therefore he is instructing us of his greatness and his monarchy. Now, that's a nice poetic way of saying something that you actually can't snuff it out from this line of Hino Adon Olam. So let me just say a word about Adon Olam. We have a song that we sing on Shabbat, Adon Olam Hashem Malach B'terem Kol Yitziv V'Nivra. The idea that Kadosh Baruch Hu is the Koneh HaKol, he owns everything and everything. Ownership in Halakha, how is ownership created? You go into a store and you buy something, right? You take it off the shelf. So at what point do you own it? I remember stores that had signs, if you broke it, you bought it, right? If you dropped a dozen eggs before you came to the checkout, you might actually have to pay for the dozen eggs. or not. I mean, the store is basically telling you you're responsible for damage. If you dropped it, if you broke it, you bought it. But that's not the way the Gemara talks about it. So what point do you become the owner? So what's the answer? If you learn Bab Metzia, what? You paid money. That's one opinion. So the answer is it's a machloket. What? Machloket. Of course it's a machloket. Pick it up. Right, so pick it up is called Meshicha. Right? You take hold of it. So let's assume you have it in your agalan, your wagon in the supermarket. So for all purposes, you took it. If somebody comes to your wagon and pulls it out, you're going to yell. You're going to yell. You're going to say, it's mine, because it might actually be yours already. You actually owe money, like a loan. The fact that you didn't pay yet, so it's like a halva'ah, it's a loan, so you have to pay up, fine. But in terms of who owns it, the store can't really tell you, sorry, we're not selling this today, take it out. It might be yours already. On the other hand, there's an opinion that says, until you pay, it's not yours. And it makes a world of a difference to know when does an object, the ownership, when does it become transferred from a halachic point of view, in terms of responsibility for that object, for geneva, for stealing, and so on. It's very important to know. So you have machloket. Fine. So like everyone machloket, so there has to be some decision, and basically the decision is that it's the meshicha, the grabbing it or picking it up, or if it's an animal, pulling it, you pull it. Beseda, you're not going to pick up the animal, but you have to pull it. You have to do some demonstrative act to show that it's yours, and then it becomes yours. The fact that you owe money, fine, you owe money, you have to pay for it. There's no question about that. That's how you transfer ownership. But how does ownership begin? If a carpenter makes a chair and a table, so it's his. He can keep it, he can sell it. So selling, what's called the whole process of kinyan or transfer by kinyan, is the mechanism that the halacha says you can transfer ownership. It doesn't create ownership. What you're buying is something that was owned by somebody else. So the store owned it. Before the store got it, the wholesaler owned it. And before the wholesaler owned it, the manufacturer, some factory that made the product owns it. Somebody's got to own it at a certain point, at an original moment. So the Rav said, when somebody creates something new, he's the owner. So if you drew a painting, that's yours. Because before there was no painting, now you're the artist. And if you make a chair or a table, so there was no chair or table before, so you're now the owner, because creation creates ownership. And that is Adon Olam. Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world, so he's the owner of the world. Now he can transfer ownership if he likes to, and he does it. He does it. That's the famous Gemara. It says on the Tehillim in Kav Daled, Lashem ha'aretz umlo'ah tevel v'yoshveva. Kadosh Baruch Hu owns the world. Fine, owns the world. And then in Tehillim and Hallel, it says Hashamayim shamayim Lashem v'ha'aretz natan livnei Adam. Kadosh Baruch Hu gave it over. So what's the mechanism of transfer of ownership? Right. The Kadosh Baruch Hu says, yes, you can have it. When can you have it? The Gemara says, after the bracha. The food is not yours, belongs to God. But if you just acknowledge, Borei Priya Eitz, Borei Minei Mizanot, Hamotzei Lechem Min Haaretz, the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, now it's yours. Go ahead, enjoy it. Enjoy it. So this transfer of ownership by acknowledging that a Kadosh Baruch Hu was the original creator. And that's what the Gemara says. So there's a mechanism of transfer of ownership, and it becomes yours. And you can do whatever you want with it, as long as it's within halachic reason. Beseda. So hino Adon Olam l'chol notzar, yoreh gedulato u'malchuto. Kadosh Baruch Hu is the sole boss, if you may. But if you take a look now at the Ani Ma'amins that I have down below, on the same page, which is a different poem. We don't know the author of, but it's the same. Again, the Rambam didn't author these words. But this is what's found in the Siddur at the end of Tfilat Shacharit. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, shaborei yitbarach shmo, hu borei umanhig l'chol habruim. He created and he leads, he directs all the creations. Hu levado asa ve'oseh ve'yaseh l'chol ha'maseh. Again, he's made it all. He's was, is, and will be of all action, all created action. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, shaborei yitbarach Hu Yachid, he's alone. Ein Yachidut Kamohu, B'shum Panim, there's nothing like him, no oneness like him. Hu Levado Elokeinu, Haya Hoveh V'yeh, was, is, and will be. And Gimel, Ani Ma'amin b'emunah shlema shaborei yitbarach eino guf, is not a body. Lo yasiguhu misigei guf. In all your thoughts, you can't fathom anything that relates to human figure. Ve'ein lo shum dimyon klal. You can't fantasize anything about what God looks like. Ani ma'amin b'emunah shlema shaborei yitbarach shmo rishon v'hu acharon. He's first, he's eternal, which means there's eternity of God, there is no eternity of the created world. And then 5, hey, ani ma'amin b'emunah shlema shaborei yitbarach lo levado ra'ui litpalel. To him, Yitbarach Shmo. Yitbarach Shmo, that's standard. Yitbarach Shmo. Lo, to him, levado ra'ui litpalel, worthy to daven. Ve'ein ra'ui litpalel lezulato, and there's no worthiness to pray to anybody else. To anybody else. So this number 5 matches the line above. Hino adon ulam l'chol notzar. What's missing in the Yigdal, you don't hear anything of that has to do with davening. That it's the one who's worthy for us to pray to. So where did the author get this from? So now I'm going to ask you to keep turning the next page, but it's going to be, so on source number 5, that's the Rambam now, no poet here. But bold letters, it says Hayesod Harishon, Hayesod Hasheni, next paragraph, Hayesod Hashlishi, Hayesod Haravi. You might be on the next page or at the third page. And then it says Hayesod Hachamishi. Are you with me? Where it says Hayesod Hachamishi, the 5th fundamental. Shehu Yitaleh, who he is God, the above. Asher ra'ui la'ovdo, to serve, is the only one fitting to serve. Uliromimo, ulifarsem gedulato, to exalt him and to publicize his greatness. Umashma'o, and his significance. Ve'ein osim kein lemashe lemata mimena. Anything under God, you don't do that. B'metziut min hamalachim v'akochavim v'hagalgalim v'hayesodot v'chol mashe hurkav mehem. There is nothing that you serve in any way, anything below the status of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not angels, not constellations, not anything. Lefi shekulam mutba'im bepulotehem ein lehem shilton velo bechira ela ritzono yitaleh. Everything about all the things you just described now, angels, stars, constellations, on the fundamentals that the world was created with, have no free choice and no will whatsoever, except that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wills their existence. Ve'ein osim otam emsaim. You can't use them as mediums. Lagia elav. You can't use them as mediums to arrive at HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ela klapav yitbarach yitaleh, only towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu alone. Yechavnu hamachshavot, your thoughts should be directed. Ve'yanichu kol ma shezulato, and just blot out of your memory any other intermediary, possible intermediary. V'zeh yesod ha'chamishi, this is the 5th yesod. He azhara, this is the warning of avodah zarah, idolatry. Ve'rov ha'torah ba lazhir al zeh. The majority of the Torah came to warn about this. Again, in the Ani Ma'amin, I didn't see a word about avodah zarah. In the Yigdal, I didn't see a word about avodah zarah. In the Ani Ma'amin, he said something about where it's worthy to daven, who's worthy to you. But the Rambam goes further and explains why he's telling us that the only one to daven to is to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Any other intermediary is idolatrous practice, including the kever of a tzaddik. Wow. According to the Rambam, idolatry. And there were so many poskim who knew this Rambam well and were very acquainted with the prevalent customs of going to tzaddikim, kivrei tzaddikim, and turning to them that they should intercede and so on, that the poskim said what you're allowed to do is stand there and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he should tap into the overdraft merits of the tzaddik. You figure the tzaddik has got a whole load of excess bonus zchuyot, merits. So you want to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if I am not meritorious and I don't have in my file what's good enough for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to deliver the goods of what I'm asking for, maybe he'd be so kind as to tap into the reserve sources of zchuyot by the tzaddik. That we don't know. But this was a type of limud zchut, where poskim knew darn well that this is very problematic custom, very problematic. So much so that the Vilna Gaon went even further, and you might say this was an anti-Hasidic step, most probably the case. He said no grave visitations after the funeral, not even for parents. Can you imagine? No grave visitations, not even parents. And he says this is the root of why Moshe Rabbeinu's grave was never known. So that people shouldn't make an aliyah l'regel out of going up to the grave of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's exactly what the Vilna Gaon was worried about. It's exactly what happened in the world of Hasidim. Yeah.
Is it true that Rabbi Feinstein and Rabbi Soloveitchik did not go to cemeteries in general?
With regard to Rav Moshe Feinstein, I cannot comment. With regard to the Rav, I can say the following. My great Rebbe, Rav Herschel Schechter, wrote in the first book that came out a year after the Rav's passing in 1994 about things of the Rav's life, and he wrote there categorically that the Rav had the opinion of the Vilna Gaon not to go to cemeteries. I approached my dear Rebbe, and I love him greatly, and I said, Rebbe, you know, we all know, you know, I know, that after the Rebbitzin passed away in 1967, he went to his wife's kever every single Friday, and he never stopped saying Kaddish for her, never stopped saying Kaddish for his wife. Now, that, you know, maybe a psychologist would be able to write a book about this very, very close, intimate relationship that the Rav never got over the loss of his wife, never got over it till the last day of his life. He was interviewed. If you saw the 2007 movie that was made about the Rav's life, it was called Lonely Man of Faith. So somebody was interviewed and who asked the Rav about this. How does this jive with the minhag, you know, so on? He says, I can't help it. I can't help myself. In other words, he realized that the family did it differently, and in the spirit of the Vilna Gaon, he just felt, I can't help myself, and he went every week. But furthermore, in the days that I was the Rav's driver, so on one Gimel Shvat, when he had Yortzeit for his father in 1975, I have the exact date, so it was Tafshin Lamed Hey, the Rav asked me in the morning, it was a Wednesday morning, if I can take him to a Brooklyn cemetery to his father's grave. And I took him. And I write about it in my book on the Conversations of the Rav, where it was the most, I called it Litvische Askara I ever saw in my life. It was the most unemotional as you can be. He just stood there, said a Perek Tillim, and that was it. The Chevra Kadisha was called Chevra Anshe Brisk, which made sense. There was from those who would, you know, came from the Brisk town of Brisk, where his family came from, and it was in East New York. If you know where the Brooklyn neighborhood is, where you don't want to walk there in the daytime. So then afterwards, the Rav takes my hand like a grandfather, and he starts giving me the grand tour of other matzevot there, and he introduces me to this guy and to that guy. And he says, and this fellow was a real Talmid Chacham. And then he says, this one, he was a joker. And then, and he goes telling me all times, it was so funny. It was so entertaining, not entertaining. And then at one point, I told the Rebbe, I said, Rebbe, you know, we're 10 minutes away from 770. You want to drop in by the Rebbe, unannounced. And he stood there for 10 minutes and thinking about it. And then he said, no, let's go back to the yeshiva. And I told him, I said, by the time you decide, we could have been there already. But he didn't want to go. Chaval. He thought about it. He actually thought about it. But I told this to Rav Schechter. So Rav Schechter says, apparently after the Rebbitzin passed away, he changed his hanhaga, his character in this one, his behavior. So he said that he will correct it in a subsequent book or add on to it. And if not, he said I should do it. So I did it, and I got his blessings, and that's it. So that's the Rav's opinion. With Rav Moshe Feinstein, I don't know one way or another. Yeah. the Rambam believes to turn directly to a person who passed away and ask for his intervention is idolatrous practice. Because the Torah calls it Doresh El HaMeitim. You know what Doresh El HaMeitim means? Turning to the dead and ask for a favor. It's clear, yeah.
To all the millions of Lubavitcher Hasidim who are regularly to the cave.
No comment. It's to daven for a schut of tzaddikim to work in our favor. We even have the famous story of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was asked if somebody can recommend a real kevet tzaddik in Europe. And he said, why go to Europe? We have kevet tzaddikim here in Eretz Yisrael. He said, fine, so suggest where I should go here. And he said to go to Har Herzl, to the kvarim of the soldiers, because he says they are real kedoshim. Yeah.
Like if one goes to
Right. So going to Marat HaMachpelah. That's correct. That's correct. So the Vilna Gaon had a problem with all that, and he felt that it can lead to behavior that's inconsistent with the Rambam. Okay, but I agree with you. You have the Medrash on Kalev ben Yefuneh. So that, okay, it doesn't say that in the Chumash. It says Vayavo at Chevron. That's all it says. Vayavo at Chevron. But Rashi, as Nechama Leibowitz taught us, we somehow mixed the Chumash with Rashi as all one big pasuk. You know, so Rashi says that he went to the Marat HaMachpelah. So this concept of Tfilat B'Kivrei Avot is something that has basis. It has basis. There's no doubt it has basis. And in the world of Halacha, there is even minagim of going to Kivrei Avot on Yemei Tzom. The Gemara Masechet Tanit talks about it, but never to address the person who's buried there. Never to directly address the person who's buried there, because that would be a problem of Doresh El HaMeitim, speaking to the, requesting from the dead, and worse yet, asking as an intermediary. The Rambam believed that this is a problem of Avodah Zarah. It's very serious. But the fact that a lot of people say Yigdal every morning and so on may most probably not be aware of the significance of every line. And that's why I'm pointing out what the Rambam actually wrote in the fifth Yesod, the fifth fundamental idea, or the fifth Ikaron, is that the reason that the only being to daven to is only the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and not to split it and so on. You know, it's not to say that there are other powers out there, and just to be on the safe side, so I'll turn to this one, I'll turn to that one, I'll turn to that one, and I'll also daven to Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's called Avodah Zarah B'Shituf. Avodah B'Shituf means I believe in God, but I also believe in Baal. And right, a friend of ours, Dr. Brian Levy, Kadosh Baruch Hu Shesenda Refuah Shleima, tells me always that I'm Oiva Avodah Zarah, because she says I'm into Beis HaBaal, baseball, and she says it's Beis HaBaal, right? You said, all right, there's something to that also. Yeah, Vaksha.
And all the people who go to a Kvittel.
Okay, so let me tell you where Kvittel started. The idea of the Baal Shem Tov, let's try to put this in a perspective, because I also come from Hasidic stock, and we're from the Sanza stock of my great grandfather was a chassid of the son of the Rebbe of Sanz, of Rav Chaim Halberstam. His name was Recheskel Shraga Halberstam, the Rebbe of Shinov. Some of you were on the trip with me. We actually went there to the kever of the Rebbe of Shinov, and we actually went once to the kever of the Vilna Gaon. And I stood there and I asked Mechila. I said, I know I'm not supposed to be here, but you can see by the kever of the Vilna Gaon Kvitlach. People don't realize. And by the kever of Reb Chaim from Brisk and the Netziv from Volozhin, Kvittel, they never received a Kvittel. Well, that's an old thing already. That's an old thing, fine. I'll tell you about that. No, so what did you ask again? I want to get back. About the Kvittel, right. So let's go back to let's backtrack to the Baal Shem Tov, 300 years ago. So Baal Shem Tov comes up with an idea, and this is where modern day Chassidut takes off. That the Galut itself, the hardships of Galut, basically are barriers to the tefillah between ourselves and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a blockade. We can't get through. And that's not something that the Baal Shem Tov invents. It's a pasuk in the 3rd chapter of Megillat Eicha, that the destruction and the galut, satam tfilati, my tfilot are barricaded, are blocked. And the question is, so if the tfilot are barricaded, why bother daven? Or you can say, well, keep it writing, keep it going, so one day the barricade will fall and the tefillot will get there. So that's one way of handling it. The other way is to basically say, and this is what the Baal Shem Tov believed, that every generation had one and only tzaddik, absolute tzaddik, and he had the spiritual ability to rise over the barricade. He can get his tefillot to the kisei hakavod, to the throne of God. And all we have to do is, do you remember we used to have, if you called chutz la'aretz here from Israel, you had to operate a dial. You didn't have direct dial. So the Rambam believes that our tefillah is direct dial, and the Baal Shem Tov said for everybody else it's operator assisted, and the tzaddik is the operator. So all you have to do is get your request to the tzaddik, so that when he davens with his tefillah, your tefillot are going to piggyback on the tefillot of the tzaddik. That's how it starts. Right, he's alive. The tzaddik is alive. So when the Baal Shem Tov is alive, and when he dies, his prime student, who's Dov Ber, the Maggid from Mezrich, is the next. And when he dies, it now goes over to, here's a machloket. Who's the 3rd generation? The 2nd generation is no machloket. Everybody knows it's the Maggid from Mezrich. So if you're Chabad, it's clearly the founder of Chabad, Shnei Zalman from Liadi, the founder of Chabad, the author of the Tanya. But he moves to Russia. But in Poland, it now moves to 1 or 2 personalities. The most famous was Elimelech from Lizhensk, the famous Noam Elimelech, and the less famous but contemporary was Menachem Mendel from Rimanov. Both places are visitable today. And ultimately, it's the Noam Elimelech who becomes more dominant because he had more Hasidim, and they branched out more. So Polish Hasidut, in the 3rd generation of Hasidut, after Baal Shem Tov and Rav Dov Ber from Mezrich, now hits Polish soil, and it spreads out from there. And what happened was, Hasidut takes over Poland, and it begins really to proliferate in the 4th generation of Hasidut, in the city of Lublin. You have to realize the city of Lublin wasn't a shtetl. It was actually the capital of Poland at that time. And when it makes it to the 4th generation, and that was the Chayzer from Lublin who makes it to there, then it's here to stay, Hasidut. But so many people couldn't see the Rebbe personally, so what was developed already in the days of the Noam Elimelech, write your request on a piece of paper and have a courier get it over to the Rebbe. So then the Rebbe is going to read it before he davens, and he knows what he's supposed to daven for. That's how Kvitlich started, because they couldn't meet up with the Rebbe every time they had a tefillah to get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but he would be the tzaddik of the generation. What happened was, Hasidut started proliferating to different towns, and each town had its own, today we call it Rebbe, but they still call them tzaddik. So they became regional tzaddikim. But the Baal Shem Tov never believed in regional tzaddikim. He believed in one and only in any generation, and no such thing as regional. He was the only one, the Baal Shem Tov. And the Maggid from Mezrich was the only one. But already in the days of the Noam Elimelech, there were already 2. There was the Menachem Mendel of Ribanov, yeah.
Sorry, finish your sentence.
And other places started having their own. And what became common was each one who had their own tzaddik, whether it was in Bobov and whether it was in Vizhnitz later and so on, that one was the only one. And Hasidut, until the Shoah, Hasidim of a particular brand, or we call it a Chatzer, never recognized the tzaddik status. They may have been great people, but they weren't the tzaddik. The tzaddik was my Rebbe, to the exclusion of every other Rebbe. Sfardim not part of this, yeah?
The Rebbe is not intermediaries like this. Why? Because they were alive.
This was the big problem that the Vilna Gaon anticipated and was trying to ward off before it even happened. But he lost the battle. He lost the battle because Hasidut became the way to go in Poland. The question was, why didn't it, what did you ask again? What's the question again? Ask the question again.
Why are they not considered intermediaries?
Why aren't they considered intermediaries? According to the Rambam, they are intermediaries. The Rambam would say, and that's all the Litvaks, all the Misnagdim said, you don't have to go to a tzaddik, right? So the idea of the kotel, by the way, of putting a petek in the kotel, that already is not, it may or may have to do, I don't know exactly what generation that started, but Hasidut comes to Eretz Yisrael about 250 years ago. The one who brings it over is actually my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. I'm 10 generations from Rav Gershon Kiteva, Rav Ram Gershon Kiteva, who was the brother-in-law of Baal Shem Tov, who the Baal Shem Tov sends to Eretz Yisrael to spread Hasidut. So maybe, I'm not even sure about this, maybe that's where it starts. But there's a tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein, you mentioned Rav Moshe, there's a tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein, who says that they heard from the name of the Rav's uncle, whose name was Rav Yitzchak Zev, known as Rav Velvela Soloveitchik. Rav Velvela is the Rav from Brisk here in Yerushalayim, that you can't put a kvittel in the kotel because your finger is going to go into the cracks of the kotel, and maybe because we're tamei, maybe the kedusha of Harabayit begins in the outer side of the kotel. So while you might be able to touch the walls of the kotel, you shouldn't put your fingers in the crevices of the kotel. So Rav Moshe Feinstein takes the task, and he says there's no such thing because minag Yisrael dinhu. There's a minag to put kvitlach in the kotel generations and generations, and it shows that there is no kedusha in the outer side of the kotel, and therefore you can still do it. So this issue of the kvitlach and the kotel makes a showing in the Igrot Moshe of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So here you have, and then when the tzaddik, if you're a rebbe, you're a chassid of the Bab of a rebbe, and the Bab of rebbe dies, so it doesn't stop. You go to the kever and you start putting your kvitlach on the kever of the Bab of a rebbe. If the Rambam or the Vilna Gaon would see this, he would rip kriya. He said, "This is avodah zarah. How can you do this?" Then you go to the kever of the Noam Elimelech in Lijens, it's piled up with kvitlach. I mean, there. Right. Okay. It's no different than Amika. But by the way, Noam Elimelech is an important station for shidduchim. By the way, there are people who go from Eretz Yisrael there. Just what? Right, for shidduchim. So I was at the airport here. Before leading a group, boarding a plane, and there was a Chassidish guy, and he was collecting money. And I asked these guys, "What are you collecting for?" He says, "I'll tell you the truth. I need a bracha, and some makubal said that I can only get the bracha by the Noam Elimelech, and I didn't have money for the flight. And this makubal said, go to the airport, and a Kadosh Baruch Hu will be with you, and you'll stick out your hand." And I looked at this guy and I said, I appreciate your honesty and integrity. Here's $50. I don't know if this is going to pay for the whole ticket, but at least it's something. And you see that the makubal was right. I said, I was so happy that he leveled with me, that he told me what he was doing. But at kedekach, the Schnorr ticket, so you can go to the Noam Elimelech and give a bracha. And with all that, one of my daughters got married a little later than some of the other daughters. Won't go into the details. And I was at the kever of the Noam Elimelech, and I'm a Rambamist, but I believe in Tefillah HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I told HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you know where I'm standing. If you can just put in a good word, about a good shidduch and so on. And within months, there was already a successful, positive resolution to that tefillah. So I'm not going to tell people not to daven for shidduchim. But I was very careful with my language. I was very careful. I said, Rabbi Shem, you know where I'm standing, right? Take it from there. Right. All right. So you have this one more point on Yesod HaChamishi. That last phrase, V'rov HaTorah ba'a lahazir al zeh. The Rambam is actually talking about the prohibitions against idolatry and all forms of idolatry. And this led the Rav to suggest that when you read the Aseret HaDibrot, the second diber, Lo yiyah lecha Elohim acherim al panai, lo ta'aseh lecha pesel v'chol tmuna, asher b'shamayim mima'al v'aretz mitachat. So here you have different descriptions of idolatry, the celestial bodies and so on. Celestial bodies, those are examples. The fundamental idea of Avodah Zarah is the first verse. Lo yiyah lecha Elohim acherim al panai. There should be no other deity before me. Means there's no toleration of any type of deity other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rav said that's a concept. That's a concept. So something has got to be the most important thing in your life. It could be an Avodah Zarah, a physical, a statue. It could be celestial bodies. It could be a concept. It could be an ism. The Rav used to talk about communism, democracy, even Zionism. He says, if the most important thing that you woke up in the morning is for something other than a Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's Avodah Zarah. It could be yourself. A person, and the Rav always said that Yahadut doesn't believe in atheism. You have to believe that something is the most important thing in your life. If it's not a Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's Avodah Zarah. It's idolatry. So it's not practice of idolatry. That's another thing. And idolatry comes in many different packages. When the Rambam writes his Mishneh Torah, so under the headline of any halacha, he tells us how many mitzvot or averot he's going to talk about in that unit. The gold medal goes to Hilchot Avodah Zarah. 53, and it's 613 mitzvot. 53 mitzvot, which are 51 don'ts and 2 do's, are factors in the world of Avodah Zarah. And there are some that the Rambam philosophically also believes is part of Avodah Zarah and doesn't write them there. So it's even more than 53. Like the Rambam believed that the cooking of the goat's meat in the mother's milk is fundamentally pagan. And we have all the laws of meat and milk, of basar v'chalav, where he writes about it in the laws of forbidden foods, milchot machalot asurot. But the Rambam believed that its source was in the pagan days, and the Rambam figured that. He gave it as a hypothesis. He was absolutely right, because there was a stone that was excavated in Syria in 1920, written in an ancient Semitic language called Ugaritic, and scholars know how to read it today. And it actually said, as a fertility rite, R-I-T-E, ceremony, to promote the fertility of the land, take a goat's meat and cook it in its mother's milk. Well, exactly what the Torah says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo, which means when the Torah gave that pasuk, people knew what it meant. It's not like today. What does that mean? I don't know. Take out your Yerodea, and wait 6 hours. Really, that's what it says.
Exactly. Why don't we take it literally?
So there is pshat. That's the pshat. And the one parshan who really, really, really hit it was the Ibn Ezra. You got it right. Everybody else has just all kinds of things around and around and around. But the Rambam suggested it as a hypothesis, and it was confirmed in 1920 that this indeed is the pshat of Lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo. There was such a, and also furthermore, the Ibn Ezra got right the second point. You know where that pasuk is found? Twice in Shmot, once in Parshat Mishpatim, once in Parshat Kitisa, as the second half of a pasuk, Reishit bikurei admatcha tavi beit Hashem Elokecha. You should bring bikurim to the Beit HaMikdash. What in the world does that have to do with not cooking meat and milk? So the understanding is the idea of bikurim was our mitzvah to promote the fertility of the land. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, do it my way, don't do it their way. Reishit bikurei admatcha tavi beit Hashem Elokecha, that's our way. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo, their way. If not for this understanding, we'd never in a million years understand why in one pasuk you've got 2 ideas that have nothing to do with each other. I mean, Torah could have given a sof pasuk and then start another pasuk, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo. And then we'd have to ask why in the world it's there. And some of the poskim say, it's there because it's Yom Tov. The Torah there talks about Yom Tov. And Yom Tov, you cook a lot, So you cook a lot, so you have to have the basar v'chalav laws there. Really? I mean, there's a third time where it says Lo tavashel gebedich halevi mo in Parshat Re'eh, where there the Torah is talking about kashrut, and that's where it belongs, and that's where it's supposed to be. But all right, so this phrase of Rov HaTorah ba l'hazir azeh means that the majority of Torah, the thrust of Torah, is to get us out of the mode of idolatrous practices and thinking. Yeah.
How does this then develop into the whole issue of not having in shul, windows in shul, any kind of a TORAH of an animal?
Yafeh. So in Judaica art, so in Judaic art, there are two schools of thought. Some say there's no such thing as Jewish art. It's Goyish art with a kippah. This pashut mode. And there's something to this, because Jewish art and music, sometimes you can see local themes that you might even see in churches, and you might even see elsewhere in our world of arts, and Jews gave it Jewish themes to it, but it's the style of others. Rav Kook didn't believe this. Rav Kook believed that there's a thing called Jewish art, and it begins with Parshat Truma and Tetzaveh, the building of the Mishkan and the Bigdei Kehuna. And if you study carefully the artistic messages and sensations that radiate from Parshiot Truma and Tetzaveh, you then can cultivate Jewish art. And there are Jewish artists from the Beit Midrash of Merkaz Rav Kook that try to develop this kind of Jewish art. The idea of figures in shul, I can tell you that some communities forbade it. You may be familiar with the famous illuminated Hebrew manuscript of the Haggadah, where you have human beings but would have rooster heads. Right? It's something that was done because human figures we're not going to have because of Avodah Zarah. So some shuls and some communities had it, allowed it, were more lenient, and some were more strict. And what can be discovered is that those communities lived in those generations where there was an issue of Avodah Zarah. Then you see the poskim are more harsh and more strict. And in those communities where it's just not an issue any longer, so they let up a little bit, and they allowed for some human figures and so on. You can see it at the Israel Museum here, and you can see it in the Polish Museum. If you've been to Warsaw, beautiful reconstructed shuls from which were originals in Poland that did have figures, even human figures. So this something had a lot to do with what was current in those days, whether there was really a sharp emphasis against any type of idolatrous practice, and they said no, even in shuls, and some places it was less so. And it becomes interesting to see it. Yeah.
I mean, today you have people coming to shul, people who are obviously religious people coming to shul, and in those shuls, the Rabbanim are saying, no, you can't have pictures of human beings or animals or whatever because it would lead to idolatrous thought. People are coming to shul to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Right. Okay, these were messages. There was messages to the greater community. I mean, you have many shuls today that have a luchot with lions on the side because of Gur Aryeh Yehuda. That may remind you a little bit of Yerushalayim, because Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah V'Bar Hashem Yerushalayim. That's why they have lions. It's not because the mayor of Yerushalayim, his name is Leon, or because Yerushalayim. Why is Yerushalayim symbol a lion? Because of Gur Aryeh Yehuda, and for sure we know that. You have all kinds of figurative interpretations of the Birkot Yaakov and Moshe in Chagall windows, and so on. And that's in a shul in Hadassah. It's there, and you can see it. And if you don't want to pay money to see it as a tourist, go for mincha. Mincha, they don't charge you. You're allowed to go in there and have mincha, and then you get to see them for free. Okay. All right. I'm going to highly recommend you to hand back the papers, because we're not through with these. We're not through with these pages, and I don't want to print them up each week. So I will be